Independence came to over a dozen states peaceably, but in the Belgian Congo, freedom was followed by rioting and army mutiny, a reign of terror and disorder. United Nations troops were called in to avert total chaos. For months, the political pattern kept changing with kaleidoscopic speed, until pro-red Premier Lumumba was seized by the forces of strongman Colonel Mobutu. But the struggle for power was far from over.
Patrice Lumumba, the hero they feared. In a forest clearing outside Lubumbashi, 3 men stand tied to a tree. It is night. There is a firing squad, a handful of Belgian officers supervising, and a small audience of local politicians who have come to watch. One of the men is 35 years old. He has been beaten so badly in the preceding days that he can barely stand. He will not live to see morning. His name is Patrice Emery Lumumba. 10 months earlier, he stood before his country and the world as the first democratically elected prime minister of an independent Congo, a nation the size of Western Europe, sitting on some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth. 10 months later, he is a corpse dissolved in acid, his bones ground into dust and scattered so that no grave, no shrine, no memory could take root. This is the story of how a postal clerk from a small Congolese village became the most dangerous man in Africa. Dangerous not because of armies or wealth, but because of what he said out loud. This is the story of an assassination plotted not in the shadows of some rogue faction, but in the halls of Brussels, Washington, and the UN itself. This is the story of Patrice Lumumba, the hero they feared. Chapter 1, A Son of the Congo. To understand why Patrice Lumumba had to die, you first have to understand the country that made him and the country that had been built, quite literally, on the bones of his ancestors. The Congo Free State was not a colony in the ordinary sense. It was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium, who ran the territory from 1885 to 1908 as a private rubber and ivory plantation. Historians estimate that the population of the region fell by roughly half during Leopold's rule, a death toll running into the millions, through forced labor, mutilation as punishment for failing to meet rubber quotas, famine, and disease. When the scale of the atrocities became an international scandal, the Belgian state took over the territory directly in 1908, renaming it the Belgian Congo. The brutality became more bureaucratic, but the extraction never stopped. Copper, cobalt, uranium, diamonds, rubber, palm oil. Wealth flowed north out of the Congo, and almost nothing flowed back in the form of schools, hospitals, or political rights. Into this world on July 2, 1925, in the village of Onalua in Kasai Province, a boy was born to a Tatela family and given the name Elias Okidasombo, later baptized and known to history as Patrice Lumumba. His family was not wealthy or politically connected. What they had was a fierce belief in education as the one lever a colonized people could pull for themselves. Lumumba attended a Protestant mission school and then a public school in Kasai, an unusual path that exposed him to both religious and administrative colonial education. He read voraciously European philosophy, history, poetry, and by his early 20s had become what the Belgian colonial system quaintly called an évolué, an African deemed to have evolved toward European standards of civilization, entitled to marginally better treatment than his countrymen, but still barred from full citizenship, still required to carry a passbook, still subject to a curfew in his own country after dark. He moved to Stanleyville, now Kisangani, and took work as a postal clerk and later as a beer salesman for a brewery in Leopoldville. It was in these years, the early to mid-1950s, that Lumumba began writing essays, poetry, opinion pieces for évolué newspapers, always circling the same question. If Belgium calls us evolved, why can we not vote? Why can we not own the land beneath our own minds? Why is a Congolese man with a university degree still not a Belgian citizen? He was, in these years, not yet a radical. He believed, like many of his generation, that reform might come gradually, through cooperation with enlightened colonial administrators. That belief would not survive the decade. In 1955, he was arrested and convicted on embezzlement charges tied to his postal job. Charges that many later historians and contemporaries regarded as politically motivated, a warning shot against an increasingly outspoken Evolué. He served a year in prison. It did not silence him. If anything, it clarified him. He emerged from that experience less interested in polite petitions and more interested in organizing. Chapter 2: The Winds of Change. By the late 1950s, the ground was shifting under every colonial empire in Africa. Ghana had become independent in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free, and Nkrumah made no secret of his ambition that Ghana's independence would be meaningless unless it was, in his words, linked to the liberation of the whole continent. In December 1958, Lumumba traveled to Accra for the All-African Peoples Conference, hosted by Nkrumah. It was a turning point. There he met other rising nationalist leaders from across the continent, absorbed the rhetoric of Pan-Africanism, and returned to the Congo radicalized, no longer asking for reform within the colonial system, but demanding its end. By this point, Lumumba had helped found and lead the Mouvement National Congolais, the MNC, one of the first Congolese political parties organized on a genuinely national rather than ethnic or regional basis. This mattered enormously. The Congo was and remains an enormous and staggeringly diverse country. Hundreds of ethnic groups, numerous regional power bases, and colonial administrators who had spent decades deliberately governing through ethnic divide and rule. Most Congolese political formations of the era were regional or ethnic in character. Lumumba's MNC was explicitly national, explicitly unitarist. A bet that Congo's only path to real strength was to hold together as one state, not fracture into ethnic fiefdoms. That bet would define the rest of his life, and it would make him enemies in every direction. From Congolese regional leaders who wanted more autonomy, from Belgian mining interests who preferred a Congo carved into pliable pieces, and eventually from foreign governments who found a unified, resource-rich, non-aligned Congo far more threatening than a fragmented one. In January 1959, riots broke out in Leopoldville after colonial police banned a political rally. Dozens were killed. The unrest sent a shockwave through Brussels. The Belgian government, which had assumed Congolese independence was decades away, suddenly understood that the timeline was collapsing. Within days, Belgium announced it would begin a process toward self-government, though even then, Belgian planners spoke of a gradual, multi-decade transition, not the near-immediate handover events would soon force upon them. Lumumba was arrested again in late 1959, this time for incitement following unrest in Stanleyville. He was in prison when the pivotal event of his career took place without him, the Brussels Round Table Conference of January 1960, where Belgian officials and Congolese political leaders negotiated the terms of independence. Facing pressure from Congolese delegates who refused to negotiate while Lumumba remained jailed, Belgium released him, and he arrived in Brussels partway through the talks, to a country stunned by how quickly its colonial project was unraveling. The date was set. On June 30th, 1960, the Belgian Congo would become the Independent Republic of the Congo. In elections that May, Lumumba's MNC won the largest bloc of any single party in the new parliament, not a majority, but enough to make him the only realistic choice for prime minister of a fragile coalition government. Joseph Kasavubu, a rival political leader from a different regional base, became president in a compromise arrangement. It was an uneasy pairing from day one, a marriage of convenience between two men who did not particularly trust each other, in a country Belgium had spent 50 years ensuring would never trust itself. Chapter 3: The Speech That Sealed His Fate. On the morning of June 30th, 1960, in a packed ceremonial hall in Leopoldville, King Baudouin of Belgium rose to address the new Congolese state. His speech praised the genius of his great-grand-uncle Leopold II for founding the Congo, and framed 80 years of Belgian rule as a benevolent civilizing mission, generously bestowed upon a grateful people. He offered the new nation advice, as a father might offer a child on how to conduct itself. President Kasavubu, scheduled to respond, delivered a measured, diplomatic reply, grateful, restrained, safe. Then Lumumba, who had not been formally scheduled to speak at all, stood up. What followed is, to this day, one of the most consequential unscripted speeches of the 20th century. Lumumba did not thank Belgium. He did not praise the genius of colonization. Instead, standing a few feet from the Belgian king, he described, in stark, unflinching terms, and to the visible fury of the Belgian delegation, the reality of 80 years of colonial rule, the forced labor, the daily humiliations of a system that treated Congolese people as subjects rather than citizens, the beatings, the segregation, the theft of land and resources dressed up as partnership. He told the room, in essence, that independence had not been given to the Congo out of Belgian generosity. It had been won through the struggle and suffering of Congolese people themselves, and that nothing would ever again justify one people ruling over another by force. The Belgian press called it a scandal. King Baudouin reportedly considered leaving the ceremony on the spot and had to be persuaded to stay. Belgian officials who had assumed an independent Congo would remain economically and politically pliable. A flag change with the same mining contracts, the same administrators, the same arrangements underneath, suddenly understood they were dealing with something else entirely, a leader who intended to mean what independence actually said. What independence actually said. That speech, more than any single policy Lumumba would go on to enact, is widely regarded by historians as the moment he was marked. Within days, cables were already moving between Brussels, the Belgian mining conglomerate Union Minière, and colonial officials in Katanga province. Cables that treated Lumumba not as an inconvenient political rival, but as a problem requiring a solution. Chapter 4: A Nation Unraveling. Independence lasted in any recognizable form for about 11 days. The first crisis came from within. On July 5, 1960, soldiers of the Force Publique, the Congolese army, still commanded almost entirely by Belgian officers even after independence, mutinied over pay and the refusal of their white commanders to Africanize the officer corps. The mutiny spread quickly, and with it came chaos, attacks on European residents, and a mass exodus of Belgian settlers and administrators, who had made up the overwhelming majority of the country's doctors, engineers, teachers, and civil servants. In a matter of weeks, the new state was stripped of most of the technical expertise it needed simply to keep hospitals and utilities running. Expertise Belgium had spent 80 years ensuring no Congolese person would ever be trained to replace. Government it had just handed power to, but by unilaterally sending paratroopers back into the Congo, ostensibly to protect Belgian civilians, but without the consent of Lumumba's government. Simultaneously, and far more consequentially, the mineral-rich southeastern province of Katanga, home to the copper and cobalt wealth that had made the Belgian Congo profitable in the first place, declared secession on July 11, 1960, under the leadership of provincial politician Moise Tshombe. Tshombe's secession was not organic. It was backed, financed, and in significant part engineered by Union Minière, the Belgian mining conglomerate whose enormous concessions sat entirely within Katanga, and which had every incentive to deal with a small, friendly, dependent statelet rather than a strong central government in Leopoldville that might nationalize its assets. Belgian military advisors and mercenaries flowed into Katanga to protect the breakaway state. For Lumumba, this was existential, both for the country and for his entire political project. If the richest province in the Congo could simply declare independence the moment it was inconvenient for foreign mining interests to deal with a unified state, then the whole premise of Congolese sovereignty was a fiction. He appealed to the United Nations for help suppressing the secession and restoring order. The UN did send a peacekeeping force, one of the largest in its history to that point, but its mandate was carefully limited. UN troops were authorized to help maintain order and oversee the withdrawal of Belgian forces, but UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld refused Lumumba's demands that UN troops be used to actively crush the Congolese secession by force. From Lumumba's perspective, the UN was providing humanitarian cover for a de facto partition of his country. Furious and increasingly desperate, Lumumba turned to Moscow. This was, in 1960, close to the most dangerous thing a third world leader could do. The Cold War was at its most paranoid. When Lumumba requested and received Soviet transport planes and technical advisors to help move Congolese troops towards secessionist Katanga, it did not read in Washington or Brussels as a pragmatic leader, seeking any help he could get to hold his country together. It read as confirmation of the worst fear of the era, that the Congo, with its uranium deposits that had supplied the Manhattan Project, its copper, its strategic location in the heart of Africa, was about to fall into the Soviet orbit. It is worth being precise here, because history has often flattened this point. Lumumba was not, by conviction, a communist. He was a Congolese nationalist and Pan-Africanist first, a pragmatist who took help where he could find it, from the Soviets, from Ghana, from Egypt's Nasser, from anyone willing to help him hold his fracturing state together. But in the geopolitical climate of 1960, that distinction did not matter to the men making decisions in Washington and Brussels. What mattered was that a resource-rich, non-aligned African leader had accepted Soviet aid, and that was in itself treated as an unacceptable risk. Chapter 5, Marked for Death. What happened next has since been confirmed not by rumor or conspiracy theory, but by declassified government documents and, decades later, official admissions from the governments involved. In August 1960, the CIA's Leopoldville station chief cabled Washington, warning that the Congo was experiencing what he called a classic communist takeover, and that Lumumba's continued rule risked delivering the country to the Soviet bloc. President Eisenhower's National Security Council discussed the Congo situation directly, and according to notes later declassified and the sworn testimony of witnesses before the U.S. Senate's Church Committee in the 1970s, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to pursue Lumumba's removal, and CIA officers subsequently discussed and prepared means to assassinate him, including exploring poison as a method, developed by the agency's in-house scientists. The plan to poison Lumumba directly was never carried out, largely because by the time the poison arrived in the Congo, events on the ground had already begun to overtake it. On September 5, 1960, President Kasavubu, encouraged and reportedly supported behind the scenes by Belgian and American officials who saw him as more pliable than Lumumba, announced over the radio that he was dismissing Lumumba as prime minister. Lumumba, in turn, went on the radio to declare that Kasavubu had no constitutional authority to do this unilaterally, and that he, Lumumba, remained the legitimate head of government. For several days, the Congo effectively had two governments claiming legitimacy simultaneously, and neither had the power to enforce its claim over the other. Into this vacuum stepped a young army colonel named Joseph Désiré Mobutu, a former Force Publique sergeant whom Lumumba himself had personally promoted to Army Chief of Staff just weeks earlier, trusting him as a loyal ally. On September 14, 1960, with encouragement, funding, and intelligence support from the CIA, Mobutu announced he was neutralizing both Kasavubu and Lumumba, seizing power in a military coup, and installing a group of technocrats loyal to himself and functionally to Washington and Brussels. Lumumba was placed under house arrest in Leopoldville, his residence surrounded on the outer perimeter by UN troops meant to protect him, and on the inner perimeter by Mobutu's soldiers, whose orders were the opposite. For weeks it was a strange, tense standoff. A deposed prime minister trapped in his own home, still recognized by many Congolese and much of the world as the country's legitimate leader, watched day and night by men waiting for the order to move. On the night of November 27, 1960, Lumumba attempted to escape Leopoldville, hoping to reach Stanleyville, where his loyalists, led by his ally Antoine Gizenga, still controlled a rival government and could offer him protection. He traveled by car through the night, through rain, trying to stay ahead of Mobutu's forces. He very nearly made it. On December 1st, 1960, Mobutu's troops caught up with him near Port-Franquis, still within a striking distance of safety. He was captured, beaten in front of journalists and photographers who had been brought to witness his humiliation. Footage and photographs that circulated internationally and shocked much of the world, and returned to Leopoldville as a prisoner. Chapter 6, The Final Weeks. What the world saw in those photographs, a prime minister of a sovereign nation, hands bound, being shoved and struck by soldiers under a foreign-backed government, provoked outrage across Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe. Protests broke out outside Belgian and American embassies from Cairo to Delhi. At the United Nations, newly independent nations demanded Lumumba's release and safety. The Soviet Union used the moment for maximum propaganda value, accusing the West of murdering African democracy in its cradle. None of it saved him. For Mobutu, Kasavubu, and their Belgian and American backers, Lumumba alive, even imprisoned, even powerless, remained a threat. He was too popular, too eloquent, too capable of becoming a rallying point the moment circumstances shifted. As long as he was breathing, there was a chance he could return. The decision was made to transfer him out of Leopoldville entirely to Katanga, the secessionist province run by Moise Tshombe, under the effective protection of Belgian officers and mining interests, who had the most direct motive of all to see him permanently silenced. This was not an accident of logistics. It was, according to later reconstructions by historians and Belgian parliamentary investigators, a deliberate choice. Hand Lumumba to the one government most eager and most insulated from consequences to finish the job. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba, along with two political allies, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okido, was flown to Katanga. Belgian officers were present at the airport when the plane landed. What followed, according to the extensive investigation later conducted by the Belgian government itself, culminating in a 2001 Parliamentary Commission report and a formal 2002 apology from the Belgian state, was a night of further beatings at the hands of Katangese soldiers and Belgian officers, followed by execution by firing squad in a forest clearing under the direct supervision of Belgian officers, with senior Katangese political figures present as witnesses. He was 35 years old. He had been Prime Minister of the Congo for barely 10 weeks before his overthrow. He, along with those of Mpolo and Okido, was buried in a shallow grave near the execution site. But even that was judged too dangerous. A potential shrine, a potential pilgrimage site. Days later, on the order of Belgian officials involved in the cover-up, the bodies were exhumed, cut into pieces, and dissolved in sulfuric acid. What could not be dissolved, bone fragments, teeth, were reportedly ground down and scattered in an effort to ensure that nothing physical of Patrice Lumumba would remain for the Congolese people to mourn over. For weeks, the Congolese government and its Belgian backers concealed the fact that he was even dead, issuing false statements that he had escaped custody or was being held safely, buying time for the story to cool before the announcement finally came, in February 1961, that Lumumba had been killed by angry villagers shortly after his transfer, a fabrication almost no one who knew the actual chain of events believed. Chapter 7. The Cover-Up and the Reckoning. The news of Lumumba's death detonated across the world. Riots broke out outside Western embassies in cities across Africa and Asia. In the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union demanded Secretary General Hammarskjöld's resignation, accusing the UN of complicity through its failure to protect Lumumba, despite peacekeepers being present near his residence during his captivity. Independence leaders across Africa, Nkrumah in Ghana, Sékou Touré in Guinea, and others, treated Lumumba's death as confirmation of exactly what they feared, that the old colonial powers and the new American superpower stepping into their place would tolerate African independence only so long as it remained safely pliable, and would move to destroy any leader who took sovereignty at its word. In the Congo itself, the beneficiary was unmistakable. Joseph Mobutu consolidated power through the 1960s and formally seized the presidency in a second coup in 1965, ruling with sustained American backing throughout the Cold War for the next 32 years as one of the most kleptocratic dictators of the 20th century. He renamed the country Zaire, renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko, and presided over a system in which a small elite around him extracted staggering personal wealth from the country's mineral riches, while the vast majority of Congolese people were left with almost none of the promise that June 1960 had seemed to offer. Mobutu himself would later obliquely acknowledge his role in Lumumba's downfall, treating it as a necessary act of statecraft rather than a crime. For decades, the full extent of Belgian and American involvement remained officially denied. Even as historians pieced together the picture from testimony, leaked cables, and the personal accounts of participants. That changed substantially in 1975, when the U.S. Senate's Church Committee, investigating decades of CYA covert action, confirmed that the Eisenhower administration had authorized a CIA assassination plot against Lumumba, though it concluded the plot was never actually executed because Mobutu's coup and the subsequent Belgian Katanga's killing overtook it. It changed further in 2001, when a Belgian parliamentary commission, after an extensive investigation, concluded that Belgium bore moral responsibility for Lumumba's death, documenting the direct involvement of Belgian officers in his final hours. In 2002, the Belgian government issued a formal apology to the Congolese people and Lumumba's family. In 2022, more than 60 years after his murder, Belgium returned a single relic to Lumumba's family in the Congolese state, a gold-capped tooth reportedly kept as a grim souvenir by one of the Belgian police officers involved in disposing of his body, the only physical remnant of Patrice Lumumba's body known to have survived the acid. It was flown to Kinshasa, given a state funeral, and interred in a mausoleum built in his honor. A burial, finally, 61 years late. Chapter 8, The Hero They Feared. It is worth asking directly, what precisely was Patrice Lumumba killed for? He was not killed for corruption. He governed for 10 weeks and left no time to build the kind of patronage empire his successor would spend 3 decades constructing. He was not killed for authoritarianism. His death came before he had the chance to demonstrate what kind of ruler he might have become. He was killed fundamentally for a set of ideas: that Congo's mineral wealth belonged to Congolese people rather than foreign shareholders, that a black African nation had the right to choose its own alliances in the Cold War rather than default automatically into the Western camp, that colonial rule required no gratitude, no soft language, no gentle transition, that it should simply end and be named honestly for what it had been while it lasted. The tragedy of Lumumba's death is inseparable from the tragedy of what followed. The Congo that could have emerged from a stable, Lumumba-led transition, however imperfect, however contested, never got the chance to exist. In its place came Mobutu's 3-decade kleptocracy, and after his fall in 1997, decades of war and instability in the eastern Congo that have cost, by various estimates, millions of lives. Conflicts still tangled, to this day, with the same minerals that made the Congo worth fighting over in 1960. Cobalt and coltan, now feeding smartphones and electric batteries instead of Cold War arsenals, but extracted still under conditions that would be grimly recognizable to Lumumba himself. He is remembered today across Africa and the wider post-colonial world, not as a man who failed, but as a man who was not permitted to succeed, a symbol invoked by liberation movements from Cuba to South Africa, a martyr whose name still appears on streets, universities, and squares from Kinshasa to Algiers to Belgrade. Malcolm X, in a 1961 address, called Lumumba's death potentially the greatest single event to happen in African affairs in a century, because it revealed with total clarity exactly how far the old order would go to ensure that African independence never became more than a flag and an anthem. Patrice Lumumba governed for 10 weeks. He has been dead for over 60 years, and still, across a continent his enemies believed they could keep divided and dependent forever, his name is spoken less as a memory than as a warning, and a promise not yet fulfilled.